Today's webinar will be presented by one of the paper's authors, Dr. Kevin Brink. We want to note that this paper is available to download from our website. The title of the webinar today, Relative Navigation of Fixed-Wing Aircraft in GPS-Denied Environments, is based on a journal article published in the summer 2020 issue of Navigation, written by Dr. Gary Ellingson, Dr. Kevin Brink, and Dr. Tim McLean. Dr. Brink is a senior research engineer at the Air Force Research Laboratory Munitions Directorate. He received his BA in Applied Mathematics from University of San Diego and his master's in mathematics and PhD in electrical engineering from Texas A&M University. His research focus is navigation in GPS-denied or degraded environments, including wide range of sensing modalities for single and multi-vehicle approaches. We appreciate the time and work that Dr. Brink and the other authors have put into this. Following the presentation, we'll take some of your questions. To ask a question, you can click on the Q&A box on the navigation bar in your Zoom client and post your question there. And Dr. Brink will address your questions. So for now, thank you for being here, and we turn the time over to you, Kevin.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'm lucky we've got Gary Ellingson also on the line, so I may field some questions and ask him to answer with some of these details. But I've been lucky to work with these two gentlemen and the lab in general at BYU over the last, I guess, probably 6 or 7 years now. In fact, Gary, when he was just starting his master's degree, was one of the first interns that I worked with over a summer at Eglin. So it's been a fun journey, and I think some of the results over the last 4 and 5 years have been really impressive. So we're excited to share with you today. So I'm going to motivate this a little bit. I'm going to wear the Air Force hat to some extent, and that's some of the perspective that you'll get here. So motivation in terms of why we're looking at cooperative navigation, provide an introduction to the relative navigation scheme that was used in this paper. And so I'll kind of use a single agent multi-rotor example that the group at BYU had been working before I even started working with them. And then we'll talk more details specific to the paper in terms of expanding relative navigation to multi-agent scenarios, and the focus of this particular paper, modifying an MSCKF to make relative navigation functional for a fixed wing vehicle. Okay, and then we'll finish up with some of the hardware and flight demonstrations that Gary produced that I think were quite impressive. Okay, so why we care, and again, asterisk there, this is a little bit of the Air Force perspective, but GPS is amazing. I think everybody in the ION forum specifically or especially knows that it has issues. It's great, but we do want to have other means to navigate when GPS is not available. From an Air Force perspective, we really can't afford to do other gold-plated solutions. So other things that are just, too expensive to mass produce. One of the creative options a lot of people have looked at over the last 5-10 years is the concept of swarming. But for an effective swarm, you're going to need large numbers. For large numbers, you need low cost and semi-expendable systems. So to make them low cost, you're going to be using low cost sensors. So to take these low cost vehicles, low cost sensor combinations, and make them do effective things more broadly, they are going to have to cooperate and coordinate. And the bottom line is, for any meaningful multi-agent coordination, it's going to require that common reference frame. Obviously, GPS can provide that in a lot of cases, but we're looking at scenarios where if GPS is not available, we still need to provide a common reference frame. And this talks really about how relative navigation can provide that, and then the proof of concept Gary put together to show that it works in the fixed wing environment. Okay, so just highlighting some past efforts in terms of cooperative. There's been quite a few. DARPA code is a big one. I borrowed this because it has wonderful graphics. So thank you, DARPA. But most of the scenarios here are 2 to 5 vehicles. In this case, they were all 4 vehicle systems. And generally, they just don't expand. Things have been fairly limited to a fairly small number of vehicles. And we want to be looking at some systems that can expand beyond that. The swarm concept, right? You've seen pictures. They've been around for a long time. But large numbers, 20, 50 more, where you're not able to provide particularly precise input to the individual vehicles, but as a whole, they're able to accomplish larger scale missions and things like that. Okay, so current and past capabilities. There's been a lot of work in cooperative navigation, especially with ground vehicles or aerial vehicles near the ground. So cooperative mapping, cooperative tasking, other sorts of stuff. That's been pretty popular. You've seen stuff like DARPA Grand T or Sub-T Challenge and things like that. There's a lot of really good literature. But again, most of these scenarios, limited number of vehicles, requires fairly significant bandwidth. There's new and exciting stuff coming out regularly, pushing those things down. But predominantly, those things just don't work well applied to a fixed wing setting. So from the Air Force perspective, and part of why I was working with BYU in the first place is we're looking for kind of alternative means to doing cooperative navigation. And we are looking for things like scalability. So specifically, I'm sorry, I didn't get the slide to jump 1 second. Scalability, specifically, if you're looking at fairly large numbers, you need to be network and computation conscious. If you are trying to send too much data over the network, it will inevitably break down. And then even if you're able to get the data where it needs to be, if the computation on an individual vehicle level is too high, you're still not able to get the job done. We're looking for robustness. We do need systems that if you lose comms, either briefly or for extended periods of time, can accommodate that and recover from it. And then in a similar vein, and we don't talk about it a lot in this talk, but minimal a priori, the less information necessary to get a system up and running, the better off it's going to be. If you require that you know where every vehicle is relative to each other to get the thing started, at any point, if that system breaks down, it's not going to recover. It's not going to come back. So the less information needed to kick it off, where you can still get a functional system working, the better. So those are kind of the highlights in terms of what Air Force is hoping to find and why we're working with some of the university groups, trying new and different approaches to see if we can't come up with something slightly different than the way industry or other groups have been attacking this problem. And I think the relative navigation frame that BYU's been working with is a good route to go. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on the relative navigation side. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. If people do have questions, you can go ahead and pop it in. And I will try to answer in real time. I'm not 100% sure I can, but I'll do my best. So the general idea behind the relative navigation is that there is kind of that classic front end estimator that is flying in real time. It's taking the IMU data and camera data and whatever sensors are feeding in real time and processing it. The idea here is that they are navigating with respect to a recent keyframe or a local navigation frame. So in this case, based on a recent image, where was the vehicle taken when that keyframe image was taken? And then it's tracking how the vehicle is moving with respect to that. After the vehicle's gone a certain distance, it's basically saying, okay, I've gone this far, I've turned this much, and here's my covariance for how I've moved with respect to that last keyframe. I'm going to create a new keyframe, and the transform between those keyframes is going to get fed into this back-end global optimizer. So you have that front end running in a very high rate, and then every once in a while it creates a new keyframe, and the transform between the keyframes is fed back into a back-end pose graph. And then it basically carries on. In some cases, it might come back to someplace near where it's been, and it might recognize a loop closure. And then basically that current front end is navigating based on the appended global frame optimization up to the most recent keyframe, and then tracking the current relative motion with respect to that keyframe. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense. We're trying to go through that fast, but we'll revisit the idea in a few slides. Okay, so saying the same thing again, you have that local frame and you are flying off of it. You are doing a relative state estimation. You are planning and doing obstacle avoidance in that frame, and you have relative control, right? So in this case, body frame velocity and or velocity with respect to that most recent keyframe. The global backend is appending those edges together to keep track of more or less where it is in the world. If you get GPS measurements coming in, that can pin down those poses in the global frame and keep track more accurately in the world where the vehicle is. And if you know where you want to go in a world frame, you can plan out a path, map it into the current local frame, and then execute your control there. Okay, so I'm not going to go over this slide too much, but here's an example of an indoor flight with a quad rotor where you can see little dots where the keyframe was going, and it's basically making laps of an indoor hallway environment. The red lines are places where it recognized that it had seen aspects of that space before and was able to provide a link between two poses that had moved to the back end keyframe. And then when that optimizes, you get a pretty strong structure for the space. So single vehicle quad rotor, and I'm going to show what I think of as a pretty impressive demo from a few years back. So the other benefit is that we get to see my two co-authors, Gary, flying as the safety pilot and Tim hiding behind the corner, but they're flying a quad rotor. Basically, I think he's acting as a safety pilot. Gary, you can chime in here if you remember, but it's able to basically execute velocity estimates based on that front end filter. And then what it's doing is sending those delta poses to a back end. And you're going to see two versions, an optimized and an unoptimized. While there's no GPS or no loop closures, the optimized and unoptimized are the same thing. It's just a bunch of appended transforms. At some point, it gets back around where it's truly back where it was to begin with, and it identifies a loop closure. So I'm going to pause for a second. You can see a couple of loop closures. And then in the back end batch, the optimized version is adjusting those transforms and getting a better fit for how the vehicle has really moved. So I'm going to skip through the slides slightly. But as it goes around, it gets additional loop closures. And then later in the run, this group allowed GPS measurements to come in to kind of show how that anchors. So right now it's done with sort of a generic frame based on the initial pose. But at some point it receives a GPS and you're able to pin that back-end graph down in the world frame. And then as it receives more GPS measurements along the way, it's able to get a refined feedback in terms of where that system was actually operating in the world view. Okay, so if you look, you can see that the delta poses, when they're appended to each other like this, it actually does a pretty good job tracking how the vehicle's moving over space. But obviously, if there's external information, whether that would be loop closures or GPS coming in, you can get a stronger system match to the world frame. Okay, so bottom line, the relative navigation was an interesting structure. I hadn't seen anything like it necessarily, where you had that high rate front end, and then you were marginalizing the data and really operating on a much smaller amount of data on the back end. It had a lot of nice features that maybe we'll go into a little bit, but where there's significant robustness in terms of if you are going a long time without global inputs, and then all of a sudden you do get a global input in, where traditional filters can fail under those circumstances. And basically, I like the structure. So we were curious if we could make relative navigation work for a multi-agent scenario. And I think the answer is yes, but we're going to start in with the cooperative back-end as one of those things. Can we use relative navigation for multiple agents? It's generating odom-like measurements from the front end. So this is my pictorial version. It's not as good as some of the other graphics, but as the vehicle moves, it's making observations to features. If we have another vehicle that's operating and coordinating, and it's also got delta poses moving through the space, and it's able to take range measurements between poses. So in this case, when a range measurement occurs, they actually need to keyframe at the same time. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Or if they're able to observe common features in the environment, so that could be loop closures or literal features. And if you get GPS type global inputs into the system, then the system's able to operate optimize. And the idea is that you've shared delta poses between each other. You've coordinated keyframing when ranging is coming in, so that both vehicles are operating on more or less the same back-end material. Let me check a question really quick. Okay, so the question was how long back in time the drone can keep track of where it was at. The answer is it depends. Because the data being pushed to the back end is a transform change in XYZ and heading effectively. So, and sometimes you don't even need Z, etc. But think of 4x1 by a 4x4. You can push a lot of that data in, and we'll talk about robustness for the factor graphs. In this case, it's really just not a whole lot of data. So you could pretty much carry the entire history if you wanted. There may be scenarios where you're pushing updates in more quickly, or when you get a lot of vehicles involved, you would worry about the full memory. But we'll discuss that a little bit. Anyway, if they're able to share their delta pose measurements, they have common range measurements between poses, they're going to optimize a very similar backend, and they can keep track of a very similar world global view. Okay, so the bottom line is that we believe that the backend is capable of the multi-agent, and it's not so bad. Here's a video of a Manhattan world, and it involves data being shared for 1,000 vehicles doing, I'm sorry, I closed that. For 1,000 vehicles doing odometry with loop closure optimization. Another student at BYU coded this up. I believe it was in G2O and C++, but basically did 1,000 vehicles, had them all share the information. The system scaled and was able to optimize it. I stopped it right here. If I keep going, it does eventually fail, and it broke. But that was without doing anything special to show robustness on the system. The multi-agent batch was born on wheel odometry and these sort of loop closure concepts. So we're really in the wheelhouse of the existing optimization strategies. There's work going on to make it more robust initialization, but nominally speaking, just the existing GT-SAM or G2O or some of these other optimization schemes are very capable of taking large amounts of delta position type information and optimizing on it pretty robustly. Okay. So what that really gets us to is, okay, for the Air Force applications or fixed wing applications, what are the challenges there? So most of the existing cooperative approaches didn't generalize. EKFs really don't like the delays, and or if you get too many of them, you're trying to share too much information. Many of those approaches are computationally intensive, okay? So I think the back-end approach, that marginalized batch approach, really takes care of those first two. So the next question is the higher altitudes, you're often lacking that geometry that was available for quad rotors near ground, and whether or not you can produce the kind of odometry measurements that this system is depending on. Okay, so the challenge is, can we provide close to at least independent odometry measurements from a fixed wing, right? Are we able to produce those same delta poses necessary to run that quad rotor example that you saw? And again, because we were talking about doing low cost systems, Gary took on the challenge of going after EO camera sensors, a fairly low quality IMU. It's a decent MEMS IMU, but it's on the cheaper side. And he wasn't satisfied with simulation. He pushed this onto hardware and showed stuff working in real time. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But really the big question is, when you're not operating in and among the environment, when you're not able to take RGBD or laser, like the distance data and stuff like that, are we still able to crank out changes in position in a manner that feeds that back-end optimization? So to go after that, Gary did do a first cut in sim. I think he did quite a good job. And that was actually published with at Ion Plans in 2018. And then he went from this simulation and pushed it onto real hardware with a real IMU camera. I believe it's the TX2 in NVIDIA processor. And so you can see real data from flights doing the feature tracking looks very similar to the simulation he did. And they went out on a test range near the school, and they flew for multiple kilometers, multiple times with the vehicle to show this stuff works. So now we'll get into how they actually went about doing that. Okay, so for this approach, Gary chose to use the multi-state-constraint Kalman filter, the MSCKF. It's something that I believe he was familiar with based on a prior internship he had done. And he had done sort of that traditional GPS-denied navigation solution. So it had an inertial frame that it was tracking over time. So it wasn't doing the keyframing, and that was the big part of the modification he had to do here. But it was operating with a fairly low quality IMU camera, and that was the extent of the aiding, more or less. So for the multi-state constraint Kalman filter, your states are your position, attitude, velocity, and traditional biases. But then it's also appending the state with the position and attitude of poses where the vehicle took prior images, okay? And the idea is that it's tracking features similar to what you saw in the image on the prior slide. And then when a feature is no longer being tracked, it's no longer available, the system basically looks at where it saw that feature at past times. It solves for the 3D position of that feature, and then it compares where it should see that feature to where it did see that feature, and it uses it as an update. So give me 1 second. There's some questions that I was going to look at. Okay, so some of the, I'm sorry for the delay. I'll come back to these in a little bit. But it's basically solving for where a 3D position of a feature was or is, and then it's looking at where it saw it in previous frames and doing an adjustment. One of the keys here is the fact that where you believe the feature is versus where you expected to see it are both a function of these poses in the factor graph, or sorry, in the filter. So you have to take that into account. There's a null space operation that they use to do that, and it's detailed fairly well in the paper, and there's some references on it. But bottom line, you are trying to basically take the last time you saw a feature, and you're trying to take the uncertainty level at that period back to a similar level to the uncertainty in your solution the first time you saw the feature. So you can't necessarily get all the way back to that uncertainty level, but you can certainly pull some of it back. And when you're doing it with a fairly wide field of view and a large number of features, it's really able to kind of have these overlapping understandings of the trajectory and basically really dramatically slow the uncertainty growth rate in that global frame. Okay, so in terms of leveraging the MSCKF for relative navigation, the biggest modification that had to happen was the ability to reset that keyframe to produce the odometry outputs. So Gary needed to set it up so that when he chooses to do a reset, the position and heading with respect to that last keyframe and their associated covariances are basically saved off so that it can be shared with the back end. The position, heading states, and the covariances are then all reset to 0, because with respect to the new keyframe, you know exactly where you are and exactly where you're pointing, and then you'll be tracking your motion relative to that new frame. Any features and associated image poses that are still in the filter when a keyframe is set are discarded. We don't carry that forward. So there is a little bit of loss of information. And if you were to take these deltas and append them, you don't do quite as well as the MSCKF, but the degradation is fairly small. And then what we'll show later, the benefit you pick up in terms of the ability to share data between vehicles, we think more than makes up for it. Although depending on the application, there's a trade there, absolutely. And then I'll just point out, and you'll see it in some plots later, that the velocity and roll, velocity, roll, and pitch are not reset. Those are body frame things that get carried through. So if you have a bias or an error in that velocity during one keyframe or one delta pose, it's likely to continue through, and you're likely to have some correlation there. And so Gary did some work to adjust that as well. When we start working with multiple agents, if we're leveraging the range measurements, as I mentioned earlier, you need to keyframe at the same time so that in the back end, the range measurements have a common poses, right, to anchor that range is tied to a position at the time the range was taken. So there was some work that's detailed more in a second paper, but specifically how to go about doing that and making sure that they were keyframing when they're supposed to. Okay. Like I said, Gary went after a fairly difficult problem, including hardware. He had to add a camera attitude offset state because, believe it or not, when he moved from simulation to hardware, it didn't all just work immediately. But he was able to add in these additional states. He had to work through hardware issues in terms of camera synchronization and time stamping. I think he did a really good job there. And then the other big things he did was he recognized that bias or the correlation between error from sequential delta poses, and he addressed that in the back-end optimization by creating a scale bias factor that effectively said, if the vehicle's moving faster than we think it is at that last time, it's likely to be doing so as well, right? So it was finding a way to not treat the sequential delta poses as completely independent, but where he could tune that so that over a course of time, two delta poses, 20 seconds apart really don't have much correlation, but two delta poses 2 seconds apart are more correlated. And it ended up providing just more robust optimization in the back end. And then the other part he worked quite a lot was the communication protocols. What data needs to be sent between the vehicles? How do they make sure that they're getting all the data they need to both reset the keyframes when they need to, but also make sure they have the proper back-end information so that cooperating vehicles have more or less the exact same back-end and are operating in that same world frame. Okay, so I'm just going to jump straight into the hardware results for the fixed wing front end. There was a picture on a prior slide. I apologize for not pulling it back up, that showed a flight path, and I'll show a video of it that will really highlight. But what you're seeing is the keyframe value for X, Y, and Z position. So this is flying predominantly in the X direction, and you can see after anywhere between 20 meters and close to 100 meters, it's resetting back to 0. So these gray lines represent a reset in the local frame. Each one of these represents a change in pose that goes to the back end. You'll notice that the body frame velocities don't reset at keyframing, so that carries forward. And like I said, if there's an error in it, it's likely to carry forward into the next keyframe as well. Attitude, roll, and pitch are not reset, but heading is reset. And so this is about a 200-second flight, and I believe there was somewhere in the order of about 70 to 80 keyframes for this particular flight demo. Here's a similar view of the same data, but with the air and then the 3 sigma plots. So you can see that the position's doing relatively well. It's very much keeping track of how it's moved in space. And then where you saw the change in pose on the prior slide, here's the covariance that's going to go with it and be shared to the back end. Again, velocity, he's flying the vehicle in a manner, velocity has to be observable. If velocity uncertainty were growing unbounded, then obviously position errors would continue to grow and cause a problem. But over short periods of time, the velocity error is correlated between one keyframe and the next, like I mentioned, and again, that was handled in the back end. You can see attitude is fairly observable. It's not great, but reasonable. And then you can see, similar to change X, Y, and Z, we have change in position as well. Or sorry, change in heading as well. Okay, taking results from that flight and post-processing it, you can see in blue the true flight profile. And again, this was on the order of about 3 miles, I believe. And if you were to run this after initialization and just concatenate the delta poses, you get the red line, and it stretches out quite a ways. If GPS measurements were applied early on in the system, what this is doing is it's basically sorting out what that scale bias is early on, and it benefits the system for a while. At some point, that correlation drops off, and it'll start drifting in a similar manner. But if other GPS measurements or other loop closures came in, it would pin that back down. So this was done in post-processing here. A similar scenario, if you had other measurements coming into the system, so if while it's flying, it's able to range to a known feature, if it keyframes during the range, you can include that in the backend batch, and it's going to aid the system. So we had 5 ranges from 2 different stations, and you can see that the truth versus the optimized backend is quite good versus what you would have ended up where we allowed for a good heading at the start, but then basically you just concatenated the delta poses, right? So they will drift over time, but not terribly. The shape's quite close. But as soon as you're able to add in additional global information, the results improve significantly. Okay, and then the final thing we wanted to show here was the multi-agent back-end processing concept. So Gary did 3 different flights of the vehicle. And then in post-processing, he looked at the GPS positions to create pseudo range, so GPS differences plus a little bit of noise, and then worked at what that backend would look like. So the red dotted lines are range measurements that came in. The red GPS measurements are measurements that were provided to the central vehicle. And bottom line is it pulls all the vehicles within 20, 30 meters of the truth for the majority of their flight. There's other versions of the same plots where you can see it without GPS. In that case, they do drift off more. They're further away from the global truth, but their relative knowledge of each other's position is quite good. So there's kind of a trade there. But it does show the promise for that multi-agent piece. And where I really want to kind of just give the rest of the time is Gary put it all together in a hardware experiment where he was flying a single vehicle that was running live the front end filter. The same vehicle had been used on 2 prior flights, and he had the history of delta poses available on a computer. He was sharing delta poses with the vehicle over the flight. And so while some of this is SIL'd to the vehicle flying, it looked just like he was talking to other vehicles flying. When they agreed to keyframe and range, it would keyframe. The information was coming in. He worked out all the protocol. And I'm going to show you a video of that front end, the vehicle that was flying, the graph that it was producing in real time. And so, Gary, if you want to provide more details, feel free to chime in. You know, this is, in my opinion, a wonderful vehicle or a video coming out of their lab. And it's showing, like I said, real-time front end, shared back-end information and coordination. Gary has the ground station in the truck. You're going to see the radio sticking out the window. Here's the image again of that flight area. And then I'm just going to go ahead and let it run. It takes a couple of minutes, but I think it's worth it. So again, university effort, primarily done by one student. Very impressive, like I said. But you get to see turning on the camera. My favorite part is it taking off. So we'll see that in just a minute. Okay, so you can see in the upper corner, this is the video feed from while it's flying. So this is what the scene looks like to this vehicle. Again, it's an IMU and a USB camera only on board for this processing. Okay, here's the optimization. You're gonna see 3 vehicles, their back-end data coming in. It was started out with pretty decent initial conditions for them. And what you're gonna see is that the unoptimized and optimized are going to look very similar for a while. Okay, so you've got the truth data going. Truth and optimized and unoptimized were the same getting it started. Once it gets going, you're going to see the truth diverge from the optimized slightly. But like I mentioned, the unoptimized and the optimized are right now at the same level. In a minute, you're going to see range measurements start to come in. And after you get a couple range measurements, you're going to see that back-end graph do what it's supposed to. And the unoptimized and optimized are going to start shifting with respect to each other. Okay, so there you can see that it's kind of averaging between the 2 airs, between green, because their heading was off. Okay, now as it moves, it's going to get more ranging from the other vehicles. And the back-end graph will start as it gets enough geometry. It's taking that range into account, balancing it out with the delta poses and those associated covariances. And you're going to see the system optimize and track more accurately with the truth than it otherwise would. Okay, so in this case, we got a little bit lucky that the air in this heading was in one direction, the air in this heading was in another direction, and this one was kind of on. So it actually balanced out fairly close, and it's doing that without GPS coming in. It is quite possible that the overall heading and structure would be shifted, and the bias would be growing. It would still be better than the average would be better than the individual vehicles. But without a GPS or something global, you might not get that right if the initial headings weren't off. But what you can see is the system, I'm going to pause really quick. The system has quite a bit of delay. So the truth is continuing to move, but the magenta stops here. The center vehicle is up here, or thinks it's up here. It's a little bit off. It does not have recent data from these vehicles. So it was actually doing some of the sharing. It was taking range measurements and requesting data, but it wasn't receiving all the data. So you're going to see that data come in just a second, and you're going to see the shift that the backend graph provides. Okay, so there you go. So the data got filled back in, the comms came back together. Because this is fairly low bandwidth, it is able to catch back up, and you can see that the optimization carried forward. Okay, so there's another paper that shows more details on the back end, the comm structure, etc., and really goes into some details or shows what would happen if you had GPS and a few other things as well that people can look into if they're so inclined. Let me move on. But I do want to highlight one last quick thing before we kind of wrap this up. For the 3 vehicles flying on that 6-minute flight, they had over 5.8 gigs of total camera data and IMU data processed in those front ends by the aircraft. But in terms of the back end, what was shared to create that graph you guys saw in the video was less than 158 kilobytes of data. So if none of the data dropped out, they would have sent about 31 kilobytes of data. In reality, he tracked it was about 54 kilobytes of data. But that's a massive reduction in overall data transmission. It lets you catch back up when you've had dropouts of a few seconds or a few minutes even. And it's part of why we think this may be very extensible to larger number of vehicles, 10, 15, 20 vehicles, okay? Just to highlight for more real-time cooperative nav results and stuff, here's the reference I was mentioning. So Journal of Aerospace Information Systems, Gary recently got this published. And so congratulations to him on that. I really like that paper as well. And I think the conclusion here is that, you know, the MSCKF was introduced as a visual inertial navigation tool in GPS denied settings, and the paper modified it to operate in that relative navigation framework where it's able to feed a back-end batch global estimator. And Gary took that, showed that it works in hardware in real time, and showed its applicability to fixed wing and multi-agent specifically. So at this point, I'd say thank you. And then I will now follow up on some of those questions, unless Rick, you have other things we need to attend to first.
No, that's great. Go ahead and do the questions. Thanks.
Okay, so I will try and answer these to the best of my ability. Let's see. Okay, so one of them is the name relative navigation and whether or not that's pointing to SLAM techniques. I would say that relative navigation has been used in several different ways. The way that we were referencing it, and there is notation there that maybe we could adjust, but it's really more about navigating off of a local frame and then updating that, moving to a new local frame as you go. That's the way that it was referred to in the background work BYU had done, and how they're using that front end back end combination. So there may be some confusion there, and I think we could probably do a better job defining it. But that's what we're talking about there. So if that doesn't answer your question, please feel free to add a second question in or follow up on that. Is there any other statistical information can be used, Q-like covariance or else? And I'm not sure exactly what that's referring to, but what I would say is that we are grabbing the, oh, I think maybe you're saying in the paper. So the papers do have fairly detailed information in terms of what hardware is used, so you can see spec sheets on that. The primary focus of the paper was to show the benefit that you could run it in real time and what the like that the filter was functioning. If we were to change out the IMU or the camera or how high the vehicle is flying or moving, we would certainly get different results. And depending on its specific scenarios, we'd probably change certain parts of this up. Again, hopefully that answers some of this information. The next question was, does any of this research compare the visual tracking with a map, elevation, obstacle database such as DTED? This particular effort does not, but there's really nothing preventing you from doing so. You could be leveraging that global map and DTED or other things in terms of a global path planner that's feeding in. And then as you're getting this information, it is also possible that you are doing things like taking those camera images while the front end is tracking features and using it in that MSCKF approach. There's nothing that says the image at a keyframe isn't held onto for that vehicle. Maybe it's shared with other vehicles, maybe not. That's a bandwidth issue. But if you're able to match that to either terrain mapping, or if you're able to do geo-registration with a reference map or something like that, and that provides a global pin, that should go into the back-end graph, and then that can be shared with the other vehicles without having to share the underlying image, which is certainly requires more bandwidth. But no, in terms of what you saw here today, it was specifically the feature tracks from the camera and the IMU, and then that multi-state constraint implementation. Okay, so somebody mentioned that they were assuming there was a LiDAR slam technique, and hopefully it was clear by the answer. No, we're not using LiDAR. It is truly just a camera. Gary was using an inverse range feature representation that he solved in that least squares step to come up with where the 3D position of the feature needed to be, to then project where he should have seen it to compare where he did see it. Again, a lot of the details in that are in the paper, and they specifically point to an appendix, and then there's references for the original papers on the MSCKF as well.
Kevin, I'll just jump in. Just jump in and say on that question that for the initial results in the initial video with the multi-rotor flying in and around buildings, then there was a LiDAR on that one, and it was a LiDAR odometry, which is really closely related to the LiDAR slam.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. So if referring to the first video with the quad rotor, yes, LiDAR, absolutely. In terms of what was shown on the fixed wing, no. Okay, so what were the units on slides 25 and 26? I believe we had meters for position, degrees for attitude, meters per second for velocity, and I guess radians for attitude. But I would have to go back and verify that. I'm assuming that that's radians based on the IMU in use.
Yeah, that's radians.
Okay. How long does the GPS denied simulated period last? That one we would have, I would need to clarify for which scenario that's referencing. So if Sharam, if I said that correctly, if you want to clarify, I'll try and answer that. Okay. Was the multi-agent testing done with multiple vehicles or the same vehicle multiple times? So that was done with the same vehicle. Gary flew it multiple times and then basically used the pre-processed the data from the earlier flights to then do playback stand-ins for those data. But the vehicle that was flying was operating as if everybody was flying at the same time. So there's a few shades of gray in that. But it's fairly representative of what the real flight would be. I will say that AFRL is taking these concepts and putting it on also fairly low TRL UAVs and stuff, but with the intent of flying them multiple vehicles at the same time and kind of just ratcheting the demo you saw up one more level. Okay, is the process of analyzing whether the current scene has been seen before, so the loop closure, particularly computationally intensive? So the answer is it can be, but it depends on how you do it. The other thing is that it does not have to happen at any particularly high rate. So you can basically keep a catalog of, in this case, it was the RGBD information from prior keyframes or from a select number of keyframes where, for whatever reason, you believe there's likely to be salient information. And then it can just kind of be running in the background when CPU is available. So nominally speaking, it is fairly high intensity, but there's been a lot of work on loop closures. Again, Gary, if you've got pieces you want to talk about here as well. But part of this is that with the back-end graph and keeping track of uncertainty on that graph, you can actually do clever things like narrow down the number of past keyframes that you look for, because you are thinking there very well may be a closure. If you're talking multiple vehicles, obviously if you get some range data and you can pin the backend graphs, you can do similar things. But yeah, operating on the raw images themselves tends to be more computationally intensive. That's part of why we didn't necessarily do that going forward, but it kind of comes down to context dependent, whether or not you need to search a lot of images or whether you can be fairly selective. Let's see. So was there any cost performance sensitivity trades done? Maybe a little bit on Gary's end, but no, this was more showing the system structure and how the front end could play with the back end and showing proof of concept of that fixed wing odometry. What I would say is, if these vehicles are flying long distances, I mean, the scenario matters a lot. if the vehicles are going to be moving relative to each other and kind of operating in a specific space and doing a lot of tight trajectory, it's going to drive different requirements in terms of how frequently you keyframe, what rates things need to be kept up, etc. If we're flying particularly long distances, adjusting it so you have either additional aiding that bounds heading drift or a better IMU, those things will certainly help. But we didn't look into that particularly closely because, again, the important part, at least at this phase, was to be doing work that was appropriate for a PhD student, so Gary could get his PhD, which he did, and that it showed the concept. And then now if we go to a specific scenario, we could get into that and do a trade saying, hey, for this regime, what would make sense? Let's see. Okay, so do the vehicles know the range between each other? Could that improve accuracy? We did allow them to know range. Basically, we were assuming a ranging radio, something that was using the waveform. Obviously, the more accurate that range is, the better. But realistically, if vehicles are a couple hundred meters apart, ranging accuracy in the order of 5 meters is actually quite useful. What you don't want to run into is where that range measurement is highly biased. And then the other part is that having range measurements really regularly is actually not that valuable unless it's a very noisy range measurement. There's certain times when the vehicles have done certain motion differences and you're basically recognizing the shifts in range that kind of drive the observability of the overall system. So we can get away with fairly sparse ranging and fairly inaccurate range as well. But that's a relative thing. What optimizer was used? So this was done with GTSAM, but there's been similar things done with G2O, and I'm sure other group or batch optimizers as well.
The initial results with the quad rotor flying in and around the building was G2O, but the work for this paper was GTSAM.
Okay, so one question: how would you see this being implemented in a larger aircraft with a nav grade IMU? Same, but just better. So I guess it depends on the trajectories that vehicle's flying. What I would say is that if a few vehicles have a very high grade IMU and other vehicles have lower grade IMUs, then all the lower grade IMUs will benefit significantly from the higher quality ones, and the higher quality ones may benefit from each other to some extent, but it will be less limited. I would say that if you go to nav grade IMUs, but you're moving much faster, you could kind of scale it up. And it does truly depend a lot on the trajectory the vehicles choose to fly, right? So if you're flying in a route that whatever the bias was on that IMU is kind of staying because you're flat and level, you're kind of getting a square root of n sort of benefit of averaging some stuff out. So again, fairly scenario dependent, but yeah, I believe it would scale up with the IMU. Did the keyframe points, were they chosen in advance or were they selected in real time while flying? So they were selected in real time while flying, and we could go through that. There's a few different reasons you would keyframe, and I didn't go into it a lot, but basically you're trying to reset the keyframe before that front end filter becomes nonlinear. So you want not particularly large errors, but more importantly, you want the covariance with it to be representative of the uncertainty. So for the quad rotor, very different requirements in some sense than the fixed wing, but generically, if you've gone a certain distance or a certain amount of time, go ahead and keyframe. If the heading changes by a certain amount, go ahead and keyframe because that can get nonlinear very quickly. There were keyframes that were set because, hey, the vehicle that was flying was able to make radio contact with the truck, which representing another vehicle. And they were saying, hey, let's do a range measurement. Well, for that range measurement to be used, you have to keyframe. So there's quite a few different criteria that could be used, and what exactly those criteria are, or which one happens to be dominant, would again be, I think, scenario dependent. Let's see. From the perspective of describing pose change between keyframes, what are your thoughts on using dual quaternions as a method of keeping translation and rotation information in a single container compared to operating on vectors and quaternions in separate algebras? Yeah, on that one, Oliver, I don't know. There's been some work at Magic Lab as well in terms of operating on some of these manifolds that are, I think, are related to your question, and whether or not that really provides improved robustness where the nonlinearities aren't as severe while you're propagating things through. I would say that a lot of what we're doing, we are cutting off the keyframes frequently enough that the representation we have is pretty appropriate. So I don't know that, I think it might let you get away with going longer. But if you're doing a lot of agents and they're cooperating, that you may actually want to keyframe more often. So it would be interesting to look at if we are seeing that there are opportunities to go longer without keyframes, but the representation is starting to cause a problem. Okay, so inter-agent ranges, how much error was assumed? So Gary, you would have to take that one. I don't recall what the noise on the ranging was.
I don't either. I was just looking through the paper. I think it's in the paper. If I find it, I'll chime in and with that information.
Okay, I will say that we've done different sim runs and things like that where varied the noise level to look at the impact on some of that stuff. The other thing I would say is that we are using the GPS solution to provide that ranging information. And for these sensor levels, there is some error in the GPS solution itself too. So we'll try and get that. Okay, so one of the questions was, how did we initialize the relative pose between the UAVs? So I'm going to let Gary tackle that one. One thing I will say is that we are doing other university level research on if you have vehicles producing these delta pose type measurements and they recognize that they're within communication distance and they can range, how do you go about actually solving that? And instead of taking, say, 5 vehicles and figuring it all out, we've been doing a pairwise approach that kind of narrows the uncertainty down, that allows a reasonable starting guess for the 5. And we've done it in an EKF where we assumed the data could get everywhere it needed to be quickly enough, but it should feed into a batch optimization along these lines. So that's definitely an area of interest. There's a few different ways to go about doing it from a practical perspective, but in terms of these tests and how to get it running to meet the need in this case, which was get them up and initialized so that Gary could show that MSCKF operating in the back end coordinating. I'll let Gary answer the initialization question.
I think your answer was pretty good, Kevin. To be honest, I missed the question, but for this work, we assumed that initialization was, from the truth sensor, the GPS INS, and then there's another paper that we refer to that has really worked on that initialization if it's unknown, and I believe that that the paper that we refer to or that we reference in our article, that method would work using this architecture.
Okay, and so I do remember some of the details, and since I did hear the question, what Gary used the velocity data coming in to basically get the scale for the system kind of up and running, and then at some point a true position and heading was leveraged. It ended up with timing issues being fairly noisy, so it was basically an initial pose for the back end with a fairly large uncertainty. And I'm going to scroll really quick to a couple of the results. I'm sorry, I skipped it. Actually, I guess the video is the best place to show it. But you can actually see that it started out pretty much at the correct position in terms of getting the back-end batch running, but a lot of the headings were offset, right? So there was an initial pose provided with a fairly large uncertainty in the graph, and then the graph optimized off of that. But it was a placeholder to get the system up and running. If people want to follow up with me later, I can talk through a couple of other approaches that you could use if you were really trying to launch a handful of these vehicles from a ground location for the kind of stuff we're talking about. And then there's very different scenarios where if they're air launched. So let's see. Okay, so the last question that I see on here was, how are the ranges between different agents determined? And it's based on it's based on the GPS value when they chose to do a keyframe. So the vehicles don't have direct access to the GPS, but what they do have is the ability to say, okay, we want to range. The telemetry is leveraged, so they can take a difference and provide that back to the system. But it would basically be done in a real system on a radio that while you're communicating, there's data in the waveform that you can basically do two-way timing. And from that, you can pull out range. So in other words, if you're able to communicate, you're also able to get a range measurement. And then it's, hey, do you want to reset? Yes, I want to reset. Okay, let's do it. They do that. They basically grab the range and they choose to create a new keyframe at the same time. So hopefully that clarified that. And I believe that's all the questions that I currently see. Okay, so the question was, how does the number of keyframes affect graph optimization? Does the backend slow down significantly at some point? At some point it will, but in terms of the graphs we were showing, I believe that there were approximately 300 edges involved in the graph that you saw in the video. At that level, a lot processors can turn the crank on that pretty well. So obviously, as you go up, it will start to get involved. That's where looking at time history and choosing to marginalize and prune stuff out could become really handy. But realistically, compared to the kinds of batch optimization that's going on for some of the vehicles that are doing like the pre-integrated IMU and bearing to a large number of features or leveraging multiple cameras or depth maps or any of that sort of stuff, it is significantly less computationally intensive. So yeah, we really didn't have to worry about that. The video I showed you of the Manhattan world was IMU or data at 1 second for 3 minutes of vehicles over the course of like 1,000 vehicles. And so, I mean, that was orders of magnitude more data points than was used in the video you saw. Okay, well, thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed.